Thank you so much. I'd like to express my thanks to the organizers, ANHAD, Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, and National Movement Front for inviting me to be a part of this gathering. It's an honor indeed to share the dais with such eminent speakers and public intellectuals. My teacher, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, having Mridula Mukherjee in the audience. And I was hoping that I would be the last speaker as listed in the program, thinking that my task would be easier, that so much would have been said that I could say. It's all been said before, and I'm only reiterating what others have said. But let me try and make some substantive points before you and hope that they make sense. Now, the issues that this seminar seeks to raise of defending rationality and scientific temper in contemporary India is one that obviously is very, very important, as Gauhar Raza Sahab has just pointed out to us. And what we are also seeing around us today is the dismantling of Nehru's legacy in another very important way, which is by destroying institutions. And particularly the destruction of educational institutions, the way in which, say, the NEP has been pushed, the way in which textbooks are being fiddled with, and so many other ways one can see how we are taking a beating as far as education is concerned, and that is going to be one of the biggest problems that we face, because if we do want to inculcate scientific temper, if we do want that this Nehruvian legacy that we have of defending rationality and science in the modern world, and which allows for a meaningful life for the citizens of India in the present and the future, then we have to ensure that our institutions are very strong. And by destroying educational institutions, this is something that is seriously, affecting this Nehruvian legacy that we've had. I would like to focus on the discipline of history. And while it is true that what Gauhar Raza said about how in the pre-modern times or in the past, we do not really have an equivocal assertion of scientific temper, of upholding science and questioning to the core ideas and concepts and so on, we do have instances that allow us to look at the way in which, for instance, rationality is given so much of importance, right? So the way in which history then allows us to look at the way in which we do have strands, we do have streams of thought which have privileged rationality, which have privileged reason with all their limitations, but nevertheless have given enough space to such ways of thinking, such ways of thought, is something that is very important for us to do. And Nehru himself, even though he does say, when he talks about Indian philosophy and religious ideas and spirituality and so on, that there's so much of waffling, and he actually uses words of this kind, that it's very hazy, and there's so much of confusion that seems to be there in the kinds of ideas that are being presented in the great texts. He nonetheless argues that it is important for us to look at the past. And the reason why it is important for us to look at the past is that the present carries a certain understanding of the past, and we need to ensure, or we need to pave the way for a scientific way in which we look at the past. We need to use certain kinds of methods that allow us to look at the past in a meaningful manner, which has value for the present and equally has ramifications for the future that we envisage. And in that sense, I quote from The Discovery of India, where Nehru says, "The past becomes something that leads up to the present, the moment of action, the future something that flows from it, and all three are inextricably intertwined and interrelated." Now, Nehru's avowal of the past is not the kind that we see today, where you have an ideologically motivated false consciousness that is promoted by the powers that be of everything. So Hinduism existed from 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, etc. And then, especially when it comes to scientific knowledge, we are told that everything happened in the ancient past. We had aviation technology, nuclear science, plastic surgery, etc. This is not the kind of avowal of the past that we find in Nehru. What he talks about is the way in which we need to understand processes, contexts, continuities, but also transformations that occur. And it is in that sense that the attack on the discipline of history is a great challenge for us in these times, and that is where we also need to then fight back. We need to assert and ensure that the methodologies that we follow as historians, as professional trained historians, that these are not undermined by the WhatsApp histories. These are not undermined by those who claim that they are not writing WhatsApp histories, but very much go along the same golden road as the WhatsApp histories, and so on. So we need to really challenge these kinds of interpretations which only seek to glorify and do not seek to look critically at historical processes. There are three digits that I will focus on. One is the issue of rationality, which I've already alluded to, and the way in which it evolves in the homegrown philosophical tradition that Nehru pays great attention to in The Discovery of India. The second being the quest for equality, dignity, and fraternity within movements, largely spiritual, religious movements in the pre-modern past. So again, as was said earlier, there were limitations. The idea of equality is not something that is far-reaching or that has a far-reaching impact, but nevertheless it is something that is there in these movements. And the third digit that I would like to focus on is the celebration of unity without forsaking diversity. Or perhaps if we look at it from the other side, the celebration of diversity while we remain cognizant of the uniting civilizational threads that existed in the past. As a historian of ancient India, of early India, I will focus mainly on this broad time period, which is quite a huge time period indeed, of almost 2 millennia, which allows us to engage with the rich, pluralistic, even contested terrains that the past reveals, which have a bearing on our present, and equally importantly, as I've mentioned, especially for Nehru, the future. Now, reason and rationality, we find, is quite interestingly dealt with in early Indian philosophy. Now, some people would like to see reason and rationality as always being there in ancient Indian traditions, that in the Vedas itself we can see the quest for truth, for knowledge, etc., which has been interpreted as rationality. This idea that, the way in which a Western definition of rationality is given is not something that we should follow, and so on. This is really something that is not not borne out when we look at the sources. As someone who has studied the Rig Veda and other texts, one thing is very clear, is that there is questioning. There is a curiosity. In fact, that is what Nehru talks of. And he says that these, there are hymns that are there in the Rig Veda that demonstrate curiosity. Curiosity about creation. Curiosity about life and death. Curiosity about where the waters come from, what happens to us after we die, and so on. For Nehru, in the discovery of India, this is the beginnings of rationality that we see, but it is not reason and rationality that is actually demonstrated through the early Vedic discussions on creation or life or death or existence. The Upanishads have again been texts that have been talked of by various people as being the fount of knowledge, whether it is Ram Mohan Roy, whether it is Rabindranath Tagore. Many of our stalwarts of modern India, many of the leading intellectuals and figures of modern India have always looked towards the Upanishads as the fount of all knowledge. And again, when we do look at the Upanishads, and again here very intuitively, Nehru says this, that the Upanishads in a way are only carrying forward the ideas that are there, the curiosities that are there in the Vedic tradition. So it's quite right that we refer to them as Vedanta. And what we find is a deeper discussion of concepts like what is ultimate reality, is there something called the soul, what is prana, what is karma, and so on. And the way in which the Upanishads actually reflect on these ideas is by trying to tie these different concepts together. And that is why they are referred to as Upanishad, which brings together. It has been wrongly interpreted. Very often we hear this. Upanishad means it refers to the student coming close to the teacher. So coming close has been interpreted like that. But any Sanskritist would tell you that what these texts are doing is it's bringing the concepts together, looking at the linkages between them and trying to see how one can raise deeper questions. Can one reflect a little more on these? But Nehru very intuitively says this again is not something that really allows us to embed reason as the basis for the questioning. You can see this where in the Upanishads, one of the greatest Upanishadic thinkers is Yagyavalkya. When he is asked questions that he cannot answer, what does he do? He says, your head will break into 1,000 pieces. Right? So clearly these are texts, even though they do have a lot in them that are quite delightful in terms of ideas, in terms of what they present to you, the turn of the language in presentation, all of this is absolutely fascinating, but these still don't come to that point where they try to instate rationality, where they have reasoning as the process for the instation of rationality, as Steven Pinker would put it. You don't really have that over here in the Upanishads. It is with the Buddhist and the Jain and Shamanic traditions and various other philosophical traditions that come up in the mid-first millennium BC, 2,500 years ago, that we actually find reason and rationality becoming visible to us as principles for raising questions, for critique, and also for arriving or for moving towards truth, towards knowledge, and the possibilities that these traditions open up for critique of the other and also of being critiqued by the other is something that is quite fascinating. If you look at the Buddhist literature, and the discovery of India actually has a couple of chapters devoted to Buddhism. And if you look at that critique, look at the Buddhist texts, the Nikayas, for instance, whether you look at the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, what you will find in many of the stories, the Nikayas are written in the form of a dialogue. So you have the Buddha who will be answering some questions and so on. And very often you have a frontal attack on the Buddha. People come up and say that, what you are saying is absolutely incorrect. Defend this. How do you justify this? Are you saying that this is the only path, this is the only means to arrive at some truth, and so on? So the importance of critique, the importance of reason, the importance of rationality is something that is coming into its own at this point of time. And it is in two of the Shad-darshanas, we have these 6 schools of philosophies, 2 of the Shad-darshanas, the ones that focus on logic and metaphysics, the Nayayika and the Vaisheshika system, that we actually find a full-fledged understanding of how to engage in critical thinking. And here then we have treatises that are being written which talk about pramana, proof, the importance of proof. It talks about, we have the emphasis that is placed on measuring the nature of the proof, prameya. We have samshaya, the raising of doubt. We have drishtanta, provision of analogy, exemplification. All of these kinds of ideas that are being brought in to talk about how to reason, how to arrive at a rational position. There are medical treatises that begin to be written. And Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, the well-known philosopher, in this excellent essay on science and philosophy in ancient India, it's in a collection of articles of his on Marxism and Indology, he says that it is especially in the medical treatises of ancient India, which continue into the medieval period, which continue to have, critiques and commentaries and so on, even in the early modern period. It is in the medical treatises that we actually find that rational methods, reason and rationality are of primacy, are of prime importance. Why is it that when we had these kinds of traditions, intellectual traditions, when we had a theoretical understanding of reason and rationality, that it does not come to roost on the center stage, is something that certainly needs to be thought about. But in the new kinds of histories, in the new kinds of evocation of tradition that we find in India today, where the past is being presented in a very stultified manner, the past is being presented in a very limited manner, it is important for us to also point out that there have been these traditions which have raised critiques, which have raised the importance of reason and of establishing a rational universe. And that is, I think, one of the ways in which we can visit the Nehruvian legacy. The second aspect that I would like to flag is equally important as far as Nehru's understanding of India is concerned, as a maker of modern India, and it rests in the kinds of values that we find enshrined in the Indian Constitution that are sought to be eroded today. I've already mentioned this, that values of equality, fraternity, justice, etc. In a caste-ridden society that developed almost 3,000 years ago, and which which transformed in many ways over these 3,000 years, but has nevertheless been quite visible and also resulted in the most obnoxious forms of discrimination and disprivilege. It is very important for us then to look at the pre-modern past and the way in which movements have come up, largely religious movements have come up, which have tried to challenge the idea of inequality, which have tried to celebrate the person who is toiling. And that is why in many of the bhakti movements, the idea of work as worship is something that is propagated. In the words of the Buddha or in the writings of the Jainas, we find that the doors of these religions are open to people across caste and creed. It's equally important to look at the way in which the doors of these religions are opened for women, something that in the Brahminical tradition there was great resistance to in the long history of Hinduism. So we do find that there have been these kinds of questionings, there have been these kinds of movements that have allowed people who have been designated within the Varna order as untouchables, as Shudras and so on, to come into the religious tradition, to at least within that community of believers, of worshippers, of people who are part of a particular movement, who see themselves as equals, and allowing them therefore a certain kind of space, even when at the social level they may continue to be disprivileged, they may continue to be on the margins. The Sufi traditions of medieval times, the medieval bhakti traditions, etc., are also ones where we find many of these ideas continuing. They are expressed in new ways, but nevertheless you do find that there is this kind of a space that is being provided for various sections to come into the community of believers. And it is here then that one sees that despite the fact that these movements may have come up in different contexts, they are rooted in a particular kind of historical situation, yet they have certain core principles that they propagate, and these core principles are values of love, peace, coexistence, and charity. This is something that is especially important in our times when we have a vilification of people for the kinds of religious practices that they have, for their religious beliefs. We have a certain kind of majoritarian assertion of what it means to be Indian. And in that sense, the way in which the Nehruvian legacy allows us to look at the evolution of different religious communities in the Indian subcontinent and the importance of giving space to all of those communities within this land is something that we can assert and we need to assert by looking at the past and the way in which these different traditions, which Nehru again himself talks about, get habilitated, where you have religions coming from outside India like Islam and Christianity, they also get habilitated into the Indian mass. Now, the third element, and I will very briefly touch upon it, relates to regional diversity, and where we have innumerable interregional differences and diversities, we still see that there is substance to Nehru's invocation of unity in diversity when we look at the way in which histories of different regions can have evolved. And there are different kinds of languages that we find in different regions. There are different kinds of cultures and practices, and yet we find that there is so much in common amongst these different regions. So that thread of unity in diversity is one which one can actually explore and establish, not in this jingoistic way that is being done today, where we talk about how some regions have been left out by historians and so on. It was absolute nonsense that is being peddled in the WhatsApp histories. What we do see is across India, in different regions, there have been very significant historical researches that have drawn our attention to the variations, to the diversities, and to the different ways in which these regions have come up and have evolved. And yet there has been an attempt in these different regions, because of various factors, to have some kind of connection, or there have been certain threads that were woven across regions as well over a period of time. And this is especially something that we need to talk about when we talk of food practices in a regional context. And I will end with this little story from the Periya Puranam, a 12th century text. This is a text which is clearly a part of the Shaivite Brahminical tradition. And the Brahminical tradition, as it came up in the Tamil-speaking region, was one which emphasized worship in the temple. It emphasized certain kinds of pujas and so on that were mediated by the Brahmins, and yet it allowed space for the bhakti tradition to also be seen as part of the newly emerging Brahminical world. And in that the Brahminical tradition then, in this text of the 12th century, we find the story of a very great bhakt called Bhakt Karnapa, who, we are told, offered the choicest of food to the god of his, liking, who is none other than Lord Shiva. And what was this non-vegetarian food that he offered? He was a hunter, and he goes and hunts down wild boar. He cooks the wild boar in the traditional manner that his tribesmen do. He tastes that pork, he tastes that meat, and to make sure that it is not too hard and that it is of the right consistency and well cooked, and then he makes these offerings to Lord Shiva. And the Periya Puranam, a Brahminical text, praises this Bhakta Karnapa as being the greatest of devotees of Lord Shiva. So at one and the same time, when you have certain kinds of ideas related to vegetarianism, related to Brahminical ideas of caste and so on that were being propagated, you also have spaces that were being given for the other, for the non-Brahminical, for those who were at the fringes, for those who were forest people, who were tribals and so on. This is that diversity which we find not merely across regions but also within regions, which we need to celebrate and to do justice to the Nehruvian legacy. We need to make sure that these histories don't get marginalized, these histories don't get wiped out in the new kinds of histories that are being propagated. And this is one of the important ways then in which we would be able to bring Nehru's ideas, which have been so important in the making of this nation, continue to be relevant. Thank you.